Nolan Strake did not have time to pray. He had a ruptured fuel line in the secondary manifold and a navigation computer that was currently recycling its boot sequence. The vibration coming through the deck plates told him everything he needed to know. The port side stabilizer was shearing off. The sound was a low-frequency hum that vibrated the fillings in his teeth. The temperature in the cockpit had dropped to 42 degrees. Strake adjusted his grip on the flight yoke. The leather was cold and cracked. He kicked the manual override pedal. It resisted him. He kicked it again, harder. On the third strike, the hydraulic fluid hissed, and the ship groaned as it fought to level out. "Mercer, tell me you have that bypass ready," Strake said into his headset. Sylvan Mercer's voice came through the comms, distorted by the magnetic interference of the sector. He was down in the gut of the ship, likely knee-deep in coolant. He reported that the primary relay was fused shut. He made it clear that if Strake didn't stop the erratic tumbling, the entire reactor would hit critical mass in less than 4 minutes. Strake ignored the warning. He had bigger problems. The long-range scanners flickered back to life for a brief second. 2 massive signatures appeared on the screen. One was a Carvis warship, an asymmetrical shard of obsidian that stretched over 2 miles long. The other belonged to the Olron, a jagged, copper-colored lattice of spheres and spikes. They were not supposed to be here. This was the null zone. It was a graveyard of dead moons and frozen gas clouds. It was supposed to be empty. "We have company," Strake muttered. He toggled the short-range sensor sweep. The display showed the human freighter, the Iron Mule, drifting directly into the center of a tactical pincer movement. The Carves and the Olron were locked in a standoff. This was not a skirmish. This was the beginning of a sector-wide war. Strake watched the power readings on the alien vessels. They were spiking. High-energy signatures indicated they were priming their primary beam cannons. In 30 seconds, the space between them would become a furnace. The Iron Mule was sitting in the middle of the impact zone. "Mercer, I need thrust. Now," Strake commanded. Mercer shouted back that the magnetic seals were failing. He claimed the torque required to fix the valve was more than his wrench could handle. He needed another pair of hands. Strake looked at the internal monitor. Taryn Lowen was in the cargo bay, trying to secure the crates of heavy machinery they were hauling to the colony at Vesta Prime. She signaled through the camera that the gravity plating was failing in Section 4. She made it clear she was staying with the cargo. She refused to leave the bay until the magnetic tethers were locked. "Lowen, get to the engine room and help Mercer," Strake said, his voice flat. He didn't wait for her response. He knew she would move. She was efficient. Strake turned his attention back to the viewport. The Carves ship was rotating. Its hull plates were sliding back to reveal a weapon core that glowed with a sickly, violet light. The Olron ship responded by deploying a swarm of drone interceptors. They looked like silver needles stitching the darkness of space. The Iron Mule continued to drift. Strake felt the ship shudder as a stray gravitational wave from the Carvis engines hit them. The hull groaned. It was the sound of old metal reaching its limit. "Reactor at 92%, Mercer's voice crackled. "Strake, we are glowing like a sun down here. If they don't shoot us, we're going to melt from the inside out." Strake gripped the yoke. He was calculating the trajectory. If he could use the remaining burst of pressurized gas in the emergency tanks, he might be able to nudge the ship 10 degrees to the left. It wouldn't get them out of the zone, but it might put them behind a floating debris field from an old mining station. "On my mark," Strake said. 3, 2, 1. He slammed his fist into the emergency purge button. The ship didn't move. Instead, something happened that defied every law of engineering Strake had learned in 20 years of spaceflight. The lights on the bridge didn't just flicker. They died. Not a brownout. Not a blown fuse. It was as if the very concept of electricity had been erased from the room. The hum of the life support system vanished. The constant, comforting vibration of the engine stopped instantly. Drake sat in total darkness. The only light came from the distant stars and the glowing weapons of the two alien fleets outside. He looked out the viewport. The Carvest dreadnought, which had been seconds away from firing its primary cannon, was dark. Its violet glow had vanished. The massive ship was drifting, its momentum carrying it forward in a slow, dead roll. Across the void, the Ulron carrier was also silent. The silver drones it had launched were no longer maneuvering. They were floating like dust motes in a sunbeam. "Mercer, Lowen," Strake called out. No response. The comms were dead. He reached for his mechanical flashlight, the one with the hand crank. He turned the handle. The internal gears ground together, but the bulb remained dark. Even the chemical battery inside the casing seemed to have failed. Strake stood up. His boots made a dull clank on the metal floor. The gravity was still holding, which meant the permanent magnets in the floor plating were still functioning, but anything that required an active current was gone. He looked back out at the two alien giants. Every warship in the sector had just powered down at once. Thousands of tons of advanced weaponry were now nothing more than floating scrap metal. In the silence, Strake heard a sound. It wasn't coming from the ship. It was a vibration in the hull itself, a rhythmic tapping. 3 hits, a pause, 3 hits. Something was knocking on the outside of the airlock, and it wasn't using a radio. Nolan Strake waited. He counted his heartbeats. 1, 2, 3. The silence was a physical weight. It pressed against his eardrums. In 20 years of hauling freight across the rim, he had never heard the iron mule. This quiet. A ship was a living thing. It breathed through its ventilation fans. It hummed through its power conduits. It growled through its reactor. Now it was a tomb. The temperature was dropping fast. Strake could see his breath in the dim starlight filtering through the reinforced glass. It hung in the air like a ghostly ribbon. He reached for the emergency locker beneath the pilot's seat. His fingers found the cold steel of a pry bar. It was a simple tool. No electronics, no sensors, just a length of forged iron. It felt heavy and honest in his hand. He stood up. His knees popped in the quiet. He moved toward the rear bulkhead. The magnetic boots on his feet felt sluggish. Without the active stabilization of the ship's internal grid, the magnets were just passive lumps of metal. He had to lift his feet with deliberate effort. Clang, clang, clang. The tapping on the outer hull started again. It was rhythmic. 3 strikes, a 2-second pause. 3 strikes. It was coming from the primary airlock, 30 feet down the main corridor. A shadow moved in the darkness of the hallway. Strake raised the pry bar. "Strake, is that you?" It was Taryn Lowen. She was the ship's navigator, but right now she was just a voice in the dark. She made it clear that she had tried the emergency flares in the mid-deck, but the strikers wouldn't even spark. She sounded calm, but there was a sharp edge to her words. She reported that the handheld chronometers had stopped, not just the digital ones. The mechanical watches were frozen too. Strake stopped. He looked at his own wrist. He wore an old wind-up piece, a relic from his father. The second hand was stuck between the 4 and the 5. It wasn't just a power failure. Something was interfering with the very mechanics of motion. "Stay behind me," Strake said. They reached the engine room hatch. Sylvan Mercer was there. He was sitting on a crate of spare valves. He had a heavy-duty wrench in his lap. The big man looked up as Strake's flashlight beam, which was still dead, passed over him. Mercer didn't need light to know the ship was dying. He knew every bolt and weld by touch. Mercer explained that the reactor hadn't just shut down, it had solidified. He told Strake that the coolant, which should be liquid at this temperature, had turned into a thick, crystalline sludge in a matter of seconds. He had tried to turn the manual bypass valve, a 300-pound man putting his full weight on a steel lever. The lever didn't move an inch. "The physics are wrong, Nolan," Mercer said. His voice was a low rumble. "Gears don't just lock up like that. Not unless the friction coefficient of the universe just tripled." Strake nodded. He didn't have an answer. He looked toward the airlock. The tapping was louder now. It echoed through the deck plates. It was a metallic sound, but it didn't sound like a tool. It sounded like a fingernail clicking against a glass bottle, amplified 1,000 times. "Something is out there," Lowen whispered. Strake moved to the airlock observation port. It was a small, thick circle of quartz. He leaned in close. Outside, the vacuum of space was crowded. The Carvis warship was less than a mile away. It was a jagged obsidian spear. Usually, its hull would be crawling with lights and sensor arrays. Now, it was a void within a void. Strake could see the massive weapon ports. They were frozen open. The violet energy that usually pulsed within them was gone. It looked like a dead prehistoric beast floating in a dark ocean. Beyond it, the Ulron lattice ship was equally still. The silver drones were scattered like buckshot. They weren't moving. They weren't even tumbling. They were locked in place as if they were embedded in clear resin. Then, Strake saw the source of the noise. A small object was attached to the exterior of the Iron Mule. It was not a ship. It was not a drone. It looked like a geometric shape made of shifting smoke. It was a dodecahedron, 12-sided and perfect, about the size of a shipping crate. It didn't have engines. It didn't have thrusters. It was simply there. A thin, spindly limb extended from the object. It looked like a glass needle. It tapped against the hull. Tap, tap, tap. "It's a probe," Lowen said from behind him. She was looking over his shoulder. She noted that the object didn't match any Carvis or Ulron signatures in the database. She suggested that, whatever it was the reason the war stopped. "It didn't just stop the war," Strake said. "It stopped everything." He looked at the manual wheel for the airlock. It was a heavy piece of brass and steel. To open it without power, he would have to break the vacuum seal manually. It would take every bit of strength he and Mercer had. "We opening it?" Mercer asked. He stood up, his joints creaking. "We don't have a choice," Strake said. "The air scrubbers are dead. We have maybe 4 hours of oxygen left if we sit still. Less if we start panicking." Strake gripped one side of the wheel. Mercer gripped the other. "On 3, Strake said. 1, 2, 3. They heaved. Strake felt the muscles in his back strain. His boots slid on the floor. The wheel didn't budge. It felt like it was welded to the frame. "Again!" Strake barked. They threw their weight into it. Strake closed his eyes. He imagined the gears inside the door, the heavy locking lugs, the grease that should be slick. He felt a sudden, sharp vibration. It wasn't the wheel turning. It was a pulse. The vibration traveled up his arms. It was a high-frequency shiver that made his bones ache. Suddenly, the wheel spun. It didn't just move. It became weightless. Strake and Mercer nearly fell as the resistance vanished. The heavy metal wheel spun 3 full rotations with a single flick of the wrist. The airlock hissed. There was no rush of air, no explosive decompression. The pressure on both sides of the door had been equalized by something Strake didn't understand. The outer door slid open. Standing in the threshold was not an alien in a suit. It was not a monster. It was a figure made of the same shifting, smoky geometry as the object outside. It had the rough proportions of a man, but its surface was a mosaic of fractals. It didn't walk. It simply occupied the space inside the airlock, then occupied the space a foot closer. The temperature in the corridor didn't drop. It vanished. Strake felt the heat being sucked out of his skin. The entity did not speak. It did not use a radio. Strake felt a sensation in the back of his skull. It wasn't a voice. It was a series of mathematical constants, prime numbers, the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter, the weight of a hydrogen atom. The entity raised a limb. It pointed toward the Carvis warship. Then it pointed toward the Ulron carrier. Then it looked at Strake. Lowen stepped back. She made it clear that she wanted to run, but her feet wouldn't move. She was staring at the entity's face, or where a face should be. The entity reached out. A long, translucent finger touched the pry bar in Strake's hand. The iron bar began to glow, not with heat, but with a clean white light. The light spread from the bar to Strake's hand, then up his arm. Strake didn't feel pain. He felt information. He saw the two alien fleets not as enemies, but as a biological infestation. He saw the Iron Mule as a microscopic speck of dust that had blundered into a delicate experiment. The entity tilted its head. "You," a voice echoed. It wasn't in the air. It was in the metal of the ship. The walls were speaking. "You are the anomaly." Strake gripped the pry bar tighter. "We're just a freighter. We're lost. We don't want any part of this." The conflict is irrelevant. The walls vibrated. The noise was the problem. We have silenced the noise. Strake looked out at the thousands of aliens trapped in the dead warships. "You killed them." "We paused them," the entity replied, "but the pause requires a vacuum of intent. Your presence is loud." The entity stepped forward. The fractal patterns on its skin began to spin faster. "We must determine if the anomaly can be integrated," the voice said, "or if it must be erased to maintain the silence." Strake felt the white light from the pry bar crawling under his fingernails. It was not hot. It was not cold. It felt like his marrow was being replaced by high-frequency static. His vision blurred, then snapped into a clarity that hurt. He could see the microscopic stress fractures in the corridor's bulkheads. He could see the way the oxygen molecules in the air were being pushed aside by the entity's presence. Beside him, Mercer gripped a handheld diagnostic scanner. The small screen was a smear of jagged green lines. The device began to emit a high-pitched whine that set Strake's teeth on edge. Mercer looked at the readings and shook his head. He signaled to Strake that the ship's internal magnetic field was spiking at 400% of its rated capacity. If the surge hit the primary capacitors, the Iron Mule would become a very expensive cloud of debris. Lowen remained pressed against the far wall. She made it clear that the entity's presence was causing the air to feel heavy, as if the atmospheric pressure had climbed to 20 pounds per square inch. She gestured toward the flickering overhead lights. They weren't just losing power, they were pulsing in a rhythmic sequence. Strake forced his fingers to stay closed around the glowing pry bar. He looked at the fractal figure. "You want silence," Strake said. His voice sounded thin in the pressurized cabin. "But you're looking at a machine. This ship is a collection of thousands of moving parts. Friction, combustion, exhaust. We can't be silent. We're alive." The entity did not move its head, but the patterns on its chest shifted. The geometry tightened into sharp, needle-like points. "Life is a calculation that has gone recursive," the walls hummed. The vibration was so deep it felt like it was coming from Strake's own lungs. "The Carvis and the Ulron are loud. They broadcast intent across the stars. They tear holes in the fabric of the quiet to move their metal. We have paused their engines. We have paused their hearts. You remain." "Because we're small," Mercer interjected. He held up the diagnostic scanner like a shield. "We're a Series 4 freighter. We don't have warp drives that tear holes in anything. We use old-fashioned thrust. We're a pebble in a pond compared to those warships." The entity stepped closer. It didn't use the floor. It seemed to slide through the air as if the 3 dimensions of the corridor were merely suggestions. It stopped 3 inches from Strake. The captain could smell it now. It didn't smell like an alien. It smelled like ozone after a lightning strike. It smelled like a clean room in a semiconductor factory. The glowing light from the pry bar reached Strake's shoulder. Suddenly, a map projected itself into his mind. It wasn't a star chart. It was a blueprint of the entire sector. He saw the 2 massive fleets frozen in space. He saw the Carvis obsidian shard and the Ulron copper lattice. They looked like insects trapped in amber. But there was something else. Deep within the Carvis warship, a single point of heat was growing. One of their secondary reactors was bypassing the pause the entity had imposed. It was a runaway thermal reaction. One of their ships is going to blow, Strake said. He gasped as the information flooded him. The Carves. Their secondary manifold is venting. If that reactor goes, the shock wave will cascade through the rest of the fleet. They're packed too tight. The entity's fractal surface slowed. The pause is absolute. Nothing moves. Your pause didn't account for mechanical failure, Mercer shouted. He pointed his scanner toward the viewport at the end of the hall. The Carves use unstable isotopes for their secondary power. If you stop the cooling pumps, but don't stop the decay, you get a meltdown. It's physics. You can't pause physics. Strake felt the entity's attention shift. It wasn't a look. It was a change in the local gravity. The iron mule groaned. The floor plates buckled upward by half an inch. If that fleet detonates, Strake said, pushing through the pressure in his chest, the noise will be louder than anything you've ever heard. It will burn a hole in your silence that won't close for 1,000 years. You didn't solve the problem. You just turned it into a bomb. The entity's limb, still touching the pry bar, retracted. The white light faded from Strake's arm, leaving his skin pale and shivering. The anomaly provides data. The walls vibrated. The noise must be prevented. Then let us go, Strake said. We can get to their ship. We have the docking codes for Carves freighters. We can stabilize their reactor from the outside, but we need our power back. We need the iron mule to breathe. Lowen moved toward the cockpit. She made it clear that the long-range scanners were still dead, but she could see the Carves ship through the manual telescope. She reported a faint orange glow beginning to emanate from the warship's midsection. The entity seemed to dissolve. It didn't disappear. It simply became less opaque, turning into a cloud of shimmering dust that permeated the air. You have 24 minutes, the voice echoed from the metal. If the noise is not prevented, the anomaly and the fleets will be erased simultaneously to preserve the equilibrium. Suddenly, the iron mule screamed. The lights slammed back to full power. The ventilation fans spun up with a deafening roar, blowing out months of accumulated dust. The navigation computer in the cockpit began its frantic boot-up sequence, the speakers chirping with frantic error codes. Strake dropped the pry bar. It hit the deck with a heavy clang. His hand was shaking. He looked at Mercer. You heard the thing, Strake said. 24 minutes. Mercer was already moving toward the engine room ladder. I need to check the bypasses. If we pull a high G burn toward that warship, the fuel lines might snap. I need 3 minutes to reinforce the seals with the welding torch. You have 2, Strake barked. He turned and ran toward the bridge. His boots thudded against the deck plates, a sound he had never been more grateful to hear. He slid into the pilot's seat and gripped the cold leather of the flight yoke. The primary display flickered to life. The 2 fleets were still there, dead in the water. But the Carves ship was bleeding. A thin trail of ionized gas was leaking from its side, glowing a sickly, radioactive violet. Strake toggled the comms. Lowen, get on the manual thrusters. We need to navigate the debris field between us and that warship. There are thousands of dead fighters out there. If we hit one, we're done. Lowen took her station. She made it clear that the debris was shifting. Without the gravity wells of the capital ships being active, the smaller vessels were drifting into unpredictable orbits. Strake pushed the throttles forward. The iron mule vibrated as the engines roared to life. It was a violent, mechanical sound. It was the sound of work. Mercer, give me everything you've got, Strake shouted into his headset. The reactor is redlining, Cap. Mercer's voice came back, punctuated by the sound of a pneumatic wrench. I'm bypassing the safety governors. We're going to be riding a lightning bolt. The freighter lunged forward. Strake felt the G-force press him into the cracked leather seat. Outside the viewport, the massive, silent graveyard of the 2 alien fleets began to rush past. They were heading straight into the heart of a frozen war with a ticking clock and a godlike janitor watching their every move. Strake didn't have time to be afraid. He had a job to do. The iron mule was not built for precision. It was a heavy lift freighter designed to haul ore through stable lanes. Now, Nolan Strake was asking it to dance through a graveyard of titanium and frozen atmosphere. The debris field was thick. Thousands of shattered hull plates from the Allron fleet hung in the void like jagged glass. Strake gripped the flight yoke. His knuckles were white. The leather felt slick with his own sweat. He adjusted the thruster output by 3%. The ship responded with a sluggish roll. A piece of a Carvess interceptor, no larger than a foot across, slammed into the outer hull. The sound was a sharp crack that echoed through the cockpit. "Watch the lateral drift, Cap," Mercer's voice crackled. "The stabilizers are fighting the magnetic pull of that Carvess wreck. If you push the engines any harder, the containment field will collapse like a wet cardboard box." Strake glanced at the countdown timer on his secondary monitor. 21 minutes and 14 seconds remained. The numbers were glowing a harsh, clinical blue. "I don't have the luxury of being gentle, Mercer," Strake muttered. He kicked the rudder pedal to avoid a drifting fuel pod. The iron mule groaned in protest. The vibration in the floorboards was constant now. It was a rhythmic, low-frequency shudder that Strake felt in his marrow. It was the sound of a machine being pushed past its breaking point. Taryn Lowen leaned over the sensor array. She made it clear that the orange glow on the Carvess ship was not a fire. She reported that it was a concentrated buildup of thermal energy. It was centered on their main communications array. The Carvess were trying to force a high-gain signal through the dampening field. That was the noise the entity wanted stopped. "If that signal goes out, the Allron fleet will think it's a target lock," Strake said. "They'll fire everything they have left on an automated cycle. This whole sector will turn into a sun." Lowen adjusted the filters on the manual telescope. She made it clear that the Carvess ship had deployed its external cooling vanes. She reported that the energy signature was climbing by 12% every minute. Strake pushed the throttles. The iron mule surged forward. The G-force pressed his spine into the seat. To his left, a massive Allron carrier drifted silently. It was a lattice of copper-colored spheres, each one the size of a stadium. Most of them were cracked open, spilling frozen air and debris into the dark. "Mercer, I need the docking clamps energized," Strake barked into the comms. "We're going to have to latch onto the Carvess hull. I can't station keep in this mess." "The clamps are fused, Strake," Mercer shouted back over the roar of the ventilation fans. "The EMP from the shutdown fried the magnetic coils. I'm down here with a manual pry bar and a soldering iron trying to jumpstart the relays." "Make it happen, Sylvan. We have 18 minutes. In the engine room, Mercer was breathing through a filtered mask. The air was thick with the smell of scorched insulation and hydraulic fluid. The temperature had climbed to 96 degrees as the reactor labored. He was hunched over the primary relay box. He used a heavy industrial wrench to shear off a melted bolt. The metal snapped with a sound like a gunshot. Mercer didn't flinch. He reached into the dark interior of the machine. His fingers found the copper bus bars. They were hot. Too hot. He took a roll of high-tensile wire and began to bridge the gap between the primary power cell and the clamp actuators. It was a crude fix. It was the kind of engineering that would get a man's license revoked on any civilized station. But out here, in the silence of contested space, it was the only thing that mattered. "Cap, if I bridge this, the whole ship is going to hum like a tuning fork," Mercer said. "Don't touch the metal casing of the console unless you want your heart stopped." "Just give me the clamps, Mercer," Strake replied. Back in the cockpit, the viewport was filled with the obsidian hull of the Carvess warship. It was a mountain of black stone, an alien alloy. Up close, it was terrifying. There were no lights, no signs of life, just the faint, pulsing orange glow from the communications spire. Strake navigated the freighter into a narrow trench along the warship's spine. The scale was overwhelming. The iron mule was a speck of dust compared to the 2-mile-long shard of the Carvis vessel. "Lowen, find me a maintenance hatch," Strake ordered. Lowen pointed to a small indentation near the base of the spire. She made it clear that the hatch was likely pressurized. She reported that the Carves used a binary locking system that would require a physical override. "We're going to have to go out there," Strake said. The thought was a cold weight in his stomach. A spacewalk in a dead zone, surrounded by 2 hostile fleets and a ticking clock. "Mercer, status!" Strake shouted. "Clamps are green. Hit it now." Strake slammed the toggle for the magnetic grapples. 4 massive hydraulic arms extended from the belly of the iron mule. They hit the obsidian hull of the Carves ship with a bone-jarring thud. The magnets engaged. The freighter bucked as it was suddenly tethered to 1,000,000 tons of dead weight. The screech of metal on metal echoed through the hull. The iron mule strained against the connection. Strake fought the yoke until the 2 ships moved as one. "We're locked," Strake breathed. He wiped the sweat from his eyes. The timer hit 15 minutes. "Lowen, stay on the sensors. If anything moves, anything at all, you tell me," Strake said. He stood up and grabbed his heavy vacuum suit from the locker behind the pilot's seat. The suit was old. It smelled of stale oxygen and recycled sweat. He pulled on the leggings and buckled the chest plate. "Mercer, get the cutting torch and the heavy demolition charges," Strake said into the headset. "We're going to the spire. We aren't going to talk to them. We're going to break their toys." "Copy that, Cap," Mercer replied. "I'll meet you at the airlock. I'm bringing the big hammer." Strake checked the seal on his helmet. He looked out at the silent, frozen war. The Carves ship felt like a tomb, but somewhere deep inside that obsidian mountain, a machine was screaming into the void. And if they didn't silence it in the next 14 minutes, the tomb was going to get a lot bigger. He grabbed a heavy-duty plasma cutter from the tool rack. He checked the fuel cell. It was full. He stepped into the airlock. The inner door cycled shut with a heavy, final thud. Strake was alone with the sound of his own breathing. It was fast, too fast. "Slow it down, Strake," he whispered to himself. "It's just a job, just another repair." But as the outer door opened and the vast, terrifying silence of the debris field rushed in, he knew he was lying. This wasn't a repair. This was an execution. The outer airlock door slid back with a mechanical groan that Strake felt in his marrow. There was no sound in the vacuum. There was only the vibration traveling through the soles of his boots. He stepped out onto the hull of the Carves warship. The obsidian surface was not smooth. It was composed of millions of microscopic ridges. It felt like walking on a frozen lake of industrial diamonds. Every step was a calculated risk. His magnetic boots engaged with a heavy, metallic clack that echoed inside his helmet. Strake looked down. Between his feet, the black alloy seemed to swallow the light from his shoulder-mounted lamps. 13 minutes and 40 seconds remained. Mercer emerged from the airlock behind him. He was lugging a heavy equipment crate. The engineer moved with the practiced clumsiness of a man who had spent half his life in a vacuum suit. He didn't use the safety tether. He trusted his boots. He signaled with a gloved hand toward the spire. The spire rose 300 feet above the hull. It was a jagged needle of dark glass and pulsing orange circuits. Up close, the orange glow was not steady. It throbbed like a heartbeat. The frequency was low. Strake could feel it in his chest. It was a rhythmic pressure that made his lungs ache. "Lowen, do you copy?" Strake asked. His own voice sounded thin and metallic in his ears. Static hissed in the background. It was the sound of the dead zone. Lowen's voice came through the comms. She was back on the Iron Mule. She made it clear that the Ulron ship was beginning to rotate. She reported that the copper lattice was shifting. The jagged spheres were realigning. It looked like a weapon cooling system was cycling. "Understood," Strake replied. "Keep the engines hot. If we have to cut and run, I want full thrust in 3 seconds." Lowen confirmed the order. She noted that the magnetic interference was increasing near the spire. She warned him that the suit's life support might glitch if they got too close to the orange emitters. Strake and Mercer reached the base of the spire. The Carves architecture defied human engineering. There were no bolts, no welds. The entire structure looked grown rather than built. The maintenance hatch was a recessed hexagon. It was sealed tight. Mercer set the equipment crate down. He opened the lid. He pulled out a heavy-duty plasma cutter. The tool was battered. The grip was wrapped in faded blue tape. It was a human tool for a human job. "The alloy is dense, Cap," Mercer said. His breathing was heavy. The suit's scrubbers were struggling to keep up with the exertion. "Use the overcharge," Strake said. "We don't have time for a clean cut." Mercer nodded. He pressed the cutter against the hexagonal seam. He squeezed the trigger. A blinding arc of white light erupted. In a vacuum, there were no sparks. There was only the molten spray of alien metal turning into vapor. The obsidian resisted. It didn't melt like steel. It shattered in tiny microscopic bursts. Strake held his hand up to shield his visor. The heat alarm in his suit began to chirp. The external temperature near the blade hit 900 degrees. The spire groaned. Strake felt the vibration through the deck plates. It wasn't a mechanical sound. It was the sound of a structure under immense internal stress. Halfway through, Mercer grunted. The plasma cutter hummed. The vibration was so intense, it started to blur Strake's vision. He checked his wrist display. 11 minutes. Suddenly, the orange glow in the spire flared. The thumping pressure in Strake's chest doubled. His HUD flickered. The oxygen readout jumped from 80% to 0, then back to 75. "Lowen, the spire is reacting," Strake said. Lowen reported a massive energy spike. She made it clear that the Carves ship was no longer dormant. She said the internal power grid was surging toward the spire. She warned them that the hull temperature was rising beneath their feet. "Mercer, hurry it up." "Almost." "There." With a final, violent hiss of escaping gas, the hexagonal hatch buckled. Mercer kicked it. The heavy plate drifted away into the void, spinning slowly. Strake peered into the opening. There was no ladder. There were no handholds. The interior of the spire was a forest of translucent cables. They looked like frozen veins. They were filled with a viscous, glowing orange fluid. The fluid was moving. It was pumping toward the tip of the spire. "This is the transmitter," Strake said. He stepped into the breach. The interior was cramped. The smell of ozone and something sweet, like rotting fruit, filled his helmet. It was the smell of alien chemistry. Mercer handed him the first demolition charge. It was a block of high-explosive composite with a magnetic timer. "Place them on the primary junctions," Mercer said. "If we sever the flow, the signal dies." Strake moved deeper into the spire. The translucent cables were warm to the touch. Even through his reinforced gloves, he could feel the heat. The orange fluid was moving faster now. The pulses were frantic. He placed the first charge on a cluster of 3 cables. The magnets locked on with a satisfying click. "One set," Strake said. He reached for the second charge. "Cap, we have a problem." Lowen's voice crackled. She reported that the Ulron ship had stopped rotating. She made it clear that they had locked their targeting sensors onto the Iron Mule. She said the copper lattice was glowing blue. "They think we're trying to wake the Carves up," Strake said. "Or they're afraid of what happens when the signal stops," Mercer added. Strake placed the second charge. 9 minutes. Lowen, can we jump if they fire? Strake asked. Lowen reported that the gravity well from the two warships was too strong. She made it clear that the Iron Mule was pinned. She said that if the Ulron fired their main battery, the freighter would be vaporized before the engines could even engage. Strake looked at the glowing cables. This wasn't a war. It was a stalemate held together by a single, screaming signal. And he was about to cut the wire. Mercer, get back to the ship, Strake ordered. Prepare the emergency release on the grapples. What about you? I have 2 more charges. I'm going to lace the core. If I don't do this right, the spire will just reroute the power. Mercer hesitated. He looked at the timer on his wrist. 8 minutes and 30 seconds. Move, Mercer. That's an order. The engineer turned and headed back toward the airlock. Strake climbed deeper into the dark throat of the spire. The vibrations were now a constant roar in his ears. His suit was vibrating so hard his teeth felt loose. He reached the central hub. It was a sphere of pulsing crystal, the size of a truck engine. He pulled the last 2 charges from his belt. He didn't think about the Ulron fleet. He didn't think about the Carves. He thought about the pressure in his chest and the smell of his own sweat. He was a mechanic. He was here to break a machine that shouldn't exist. He set the timers for 5 minutes. Strake to Iron Mule. Charges are set. I'm coming home. He turned to leave, but the orange fluid in the cables suddenly turned a deep, angry red. The spire began to shiver. A low-frequency hum, deeper than anything he had ever heard, shook the entire warship. Strake felt his boots lose their grip. The magnetic field of the ship was failing. Lowen, Mercer, the hull is losing magnetism. Get the engines. The comms cut to dead silence. Strake was floating in the dark inside the throat of an alien god, and the clock was still ticking. 7 minutes. He grabbed a cable and pulled himself toward the hatch. He had to get out. He had to get to the mule. But as he reached the hexagonal opening, he saw it. The Ulron ship was no longer blue. It was white. A blinding, pure white light was gathering at the center of the copper lattice. They weren't waiting for the signal to stop. They were ending the conversation. Strake's magnetic boots were dead weight. Without the ship's artificial gravity or the spire's internal field, he was nothing but 180 pounds of meat and pressurized nylon drifting in a dark cathedral of alien geometry. He kicked off a protruding rib of obsidian, his gloved hand catching a jagged edge of the cooling rack. The metal was so cold it felt like it was biting through his thermal layers. He looked back at the central hub. The orange fluid had turned a violent, bruised purple. The hum was no longer a sound. It was a physical assault that made his vision blur. Mercer, do you copy? Strake grunted. The effort of moving in zero gravity was spiking his heart rate to 110 beats per minute. Static scratched at his eardrums. Then, a thin sliver of Mercer's voice broke through. He reported that the Iron Mule was experiencing massive power surges. He made it clear that the proximity to the Ulron's energy buildup was frying their external sensors. I'm at the hatch, Strake said, his voice sounding hollow in his own helmet. Tell Lowen to prep the thrusters. I'm going to have to jump for it. Lowen's response came through Mercer as a relayed frantic warning. She made it clear that the Ulron ship had reached 95% charge. She reported that the energy signature was a localized neutron lance. If they fired, the beam would cook the Carves spire and everything within a 5-mile radius. She insisted that they had less than 3 minutes before the copper lattice released the strike. Strake reached the hexagonal airlock. The Iron Mule looked like a rusted toy floating against the backdrop of the massive Carves hull. The umbilical tether was whipping violently, caught in the fluctuating gravitational eddies between the two warships. Mercer, release the magnetic grapples on my mark, Strake ordered. I'm coming in hot. He didn't wait for a confirmation. Strake braced his feet against the rim of the Carves airlock and pushed. He was a projectile now, drifting through the void toward the open cargo bay of the freighter. The silence of space was a lie. He could feel the vibration of the Ulron weapon in the marrow of his bones. It was a low-frequency thrum that suggested the very fabric of the sector was being stretched to a breaking point. He hit the mule's deck plates with a bone-jarring thud. His shoulder screamed in protest as he rolled into the bay. Mercer was there, his faceplate smeared with grease and sweat. The engineer grabbed Strake by the webbing of his suit and hauled him toward the inner bulkhead. "The charges?" Mercer shouted over the roar of the freighter's struggling life support. 5 minutes on the clock, Strake said, hitting the manual override to slam the cargo door shut. "But the Ulron aren't going to give us 5 minutes." They scrambled into the cockpit. The heat had returned, but it was the wrong kind of heat, the smell of burning insulation and overworked processors. Lowen was a blur of motion in the pilot's seat. She reported that the Ulron weapon was locked on the Carves core. She made it clear that the Iron Mule was directly in the line of fire. "They aren't trying to kill us," Strake realized, staring at the tactical display. "They're trying to cauterize the wound. They think the Carves ship is waking up to finish a war that ended 1,000 years ago." "It's not waking up," Mercer said, his fingers flying across a diagnostic pad. "Look at the energy bleed. This isn't a combat sequence. It's a failing life support loop. The ship is dying, Strake. The signal is a death rattle." "Then we end it now," Strake said. He reached for the remote detonator strapped to his forearm. "Lowen, give me everything the engines have. Get us behind the Carves superstructure. Use the warship as a shield." Lowen didn't argue. She reported that the thrusters were at 104% capacity. She made it clear that the hull might not hold under the stress. The Iron Mule groaned, a deep, metallic protest that vibrated through the floorboards. The freighter lurched, pivoting on its axis as the maneuvering jets fired in a desperate burst. Strake watched the Ulron ship on the monitor. The white light at the center of the copper lattice was blinding now, a miniature sun birthed in the dark of contested space. 3, 2, 1. Strake counted. He flipped the safety cover and pressed the primary trigger. The 3 charges he had planted deep within the Carves spire didn't produce a fireball. There was no oxygen to feed a flame. Instead, they delivered a precise, high-velocity, kinetic shock to the central power relays. The effect was instantaneous. The purple fluid in the cables shattered into frozen crystals. The screaming signal, the one that had paralyzed every warship in the sector, simply vanished. The silence that followed was more deafening than the noise had been. On the long-range scanners, the Ulron ship's energy signature flickered. The white light began to bleed away, dissipating into the vacuum. "They're standing down," Mercer whispered, his voice thick with relief. Strake watched the monitors. The Ulron ship remained dark. The Carves warship, once a looming threat of ancient malice, was now just a 2-mile-long tomb of obsidian and ice. Without the signal, the ghost was gone. The threat was no longer a weapon. It was just salvage. "Lowen, get us out of here," Strake said. He leaned back in his seat, feeling every one of his 45 years. "Set a course for the nearest independent station and tell the crew to keep the comms silent. I don't want to talk to anyone for a week." Lowen reported that the jump drive was spinning up. She made it clear that the Iron Mule would need a month in dry dock to repair the structural damage. She said the Ulron were turning away, retreating back into the shadows of their own territory. "Let them go," Strake said. He pulled a wrench from his belt and looked at it. The tool was scarred and worn, but it hadn't failed him. The universe was a series of problems, some of them as big as gods, and some as small as a ruptured fuel line. In the end, they all yielded to the same thing, a man with the right tool and the nerve to use it. The Iron Mule lurched one final time as the warp field engaged. The stars stretched into long white lines, and the contested sector vanished behind them. "Mercer," Strake said, closing his eyes. "Yeah, Cap. Remind me to charge the Ulron for the repairs. I think we just saved them a war." Mercer let out a dry, hacking laugh. He reported that he would add it to the invoice right under the cost of the magnetic charges. The freighter drifted into the safety of hyperspace, a small battered machine that had looked into the eyes of giants and decided it was time to go to work.